Hello, my name's David Greenwood. I'm a partner at Odgers Berndtson, the executive search firm based in Dubai. I'm doing a number of interviews over the next few weeks with senior executives, and I'm very privileged and delighted, in fact, to have David Fairhurst on the line from Chicago in the US. David was the former global chief people officer for McDonald's Corporation. McDonald's is one of the largest companies in the world with over 2 million employees servicing 120 countries. Prior to that, David was the group HR director for Tesco PLC and then Heinz GSK prior to that. Welcome, David.
Pleasure to be with you. Thank you, David.
A few questions that I have been posed over the last few weeks, David, from a number of executives, albeit in the HR practitioner or the senior leaders of an organization at C-suite or even board, is the value that leaders need to portray to their employees. And with the vast number of employees that you have experienced in the past, could you describe to the audience what are the key, key drivers and the key things that you believe should be out there at the moment?
Well, yeah, I mean, these are very worrying and unprecedented times for leaders in organizations. And a lot has already been said in media about the quality of leadership that's going to be required to help us get through these difficult times. And indeed, as leaders or as HR practitioners, we need to make sure we look after ourselves to make sure that we can continue to serve people in our organizations. But there are a few things that spring to mind relative to the value that we can create in our thinking right now in organizations. And the first and foremost to me is around talent. Talent always has been important. It's the king of topics in organizations, but it needs to continue to be a focus during these times, and particularly to continue to have a long-term view around talent in our organizations. And in the short term, making sure that we look after our talent such that they continue to look after us in business. The second thing is around well-being. Well-being is a topic, I think, of great value. It was already becoming a very prominent discussion in many boardrooms of many organizations and of interest. But of course, now it's shot up in terms of its interest level as a topic, the well-being of people, whether we're talking psychological, mental, financial, or whatever, well-being of our people is really important. A lot is going to be expected of organizations post-COVID-19 relative to the well-being of our staff, not just getting them back into the workplace, but then how we evolve the working practices. Even to the extent, I would say, that there is conversations going on right now around whether organizations need a chief well-being officer, and what does that look like? So that's a really interesting conversation and potentially a really interesting role for people going forwards. When it talk about well-being, of course, a lot of people concerned about money, their finances, and it can be a real source of stress. So continue to innovate around financial well-being is really important during this particular period of time and as we face the next year or two. I've got involved in an organization called WageStream, which are innovating around financial education, wage streaming, pay streaming, so that you can pull down your pay quicker, helping people to encourage to save and to deal with financial difficulties, etc. These sorts of organizations are really important. Innovation around financial well-being, I think, will be a particularly important topic. Also, there is an essential role for us as leaders in organizations to ensure that the voice of people and consideration around people continues to happen at the senior table. There are lots of stresses and strains in conversations right now, some seemingly irreconcilable dilemmas that organizations need to face. And it's very easy to get pulled into financial, operational, customer type debates. You need to make sure that the voice of people continues to be happening at the table. And finally, what I would say is this is an interesting period of time amongst all the hustle and bustle and stresses to actually take a step back and think, what have we learned during this as leaders or as HR professionals? What have we learned? What have we learned about leadership? What would we do differently? What have we learned about the quality of our talent? Where do we need to invest in different skills and different talents going forward? Because things like this will happen again. So using this as a learning process, I think, is an incredibly valuable thing for leaders to force themselves almost to think about right now to ensure that they're fit for the future.
And I think there's two key things that you raised there. One is you look after your people in certain times like this, and they will pay you back long term. And it really shows some of the practices that have been implemented, that really does add that value to the individual. And I think the second thing is that, ultimately what happens today in terms of some of the practices that are conducted in the last 12, I'd say 12 weeks can typically take 12 months, particularly in certain functions like human resources. And I think those project management skills have really been highlighted, and there's lots of learnings from that. And that we aren't able to do that within that period of time. I think that will ultimately be removed. If you don't mind me saying, David, there was one prediction that you raised in the Financial Times in 2014 about the workforce. I'm not going to say the actual quote, but you may well do. Where are we now? It's 2020. It's 6 years on. Is that prediction now coming to the table?
Yeah, well, at the time in 2014, I was working at McDonald's, but I was also a skills commissioner representing the British government, and I had access to real data around births and death rates in Europe and subsequently other countries. And it struck me as I was working with some pretty clever statisticians and some of my team that there was going to be an issue, and there was going to be something what I was going to call as a workforce cliff. In other words, that the supply of labor was not going to be enough. And this wasn't futurology, this was a reality. Not enough babies had been born that were going to supply the demand of the workforce. And even to the extent that we could predict it by country, by month, by year. So at the front end was Germany and Holland. Around now was the UK. The US was probably another year away. And broadly, those predictions came to fruition. And what happened is that employers were finding it harder and harder to provide labor. And this, by the way, wasn't just a McDonald's issue. This was an industry-wide issue. Of course, those employers that relied on the younger end, the entry-level end to the organization, were going to get hit the first, like McDonald's, but others were going to feel the pinch. And what I said, so the prediction came true. What I said was that if we could start to encourage people to return to the workforce, perhaps those who were just able to work but not working, that we could probably stave off this issue for maybe up to 10 years. And by that, I'm talking about women that didn't return after having children, bringing up children, talking about people with disabilities. There are certain pockets of youth that are just unemployable. There were certain ethnic minorities that continued to grow in population size, so they could be tapped into more. So this was the best ever case, by the way, for diversity. This was an economic business need case around being more inclusive and getting people into the workplace. As a result of that, the people practices over the last number of years since 2014, as a result of need, because businesses were finding it harder and harder to recruit, businesses were becoming better with their employee experience, better with their employer branding, more innovative with their employment practices, because they were trying harder and harder and harder to actually, circumvent this labor issue. So that's the good news. The bad news now is that what's likely to happen with COVID-19 is that the workforce cliff, this shortage of labor around the world, is likely to probably be delayed by 3 to 5 years. As a result, of course, Germany and Holland and places like that are already had very low unemployment. But countries like the UK, US and beyond, who are starting to feel the real pinch of labor, that's going to be backed off for about 3 to 5 years. The key question for employers now is, have they learned the lessons from 2014 when some of the people practices were not very progressive, when you had millions of young people unemployed around the world, so you didn't have to try very hard to hire people, hire them and fire them, who cares? That we've moved on from that, and we've really made some great progress in the workplace around people practices. The question now is, when the labor market eases, will the employers continue to be progressive, learn the lessons of 2014, or will we go back 10 years? And that's going to be a fundamental challenge for leadership.
And it leads me nicely on. If we talk about trends, I mean, we talk about trends in the next 5 years. It's probably more relevant to talk about trends in the next 12 months. But either or, what would be the key trends do you think that will be starting to come out from employers, and ultimately be at the boardroom when you're in those discussions with your senior team and your peers and the board? What trends do you see coming in?
Well, I think there's some really interesting trends and progress over, as I said, since 2014, that I pray that they continue to be the sorts of things that we see over the next 5 years. Because, by the way, if employers were as reactive as they were in 2014 and do not progress in the way that we have over the last 5 years, then they will face the cliff again in 3 more years' time, and they'll be found wanting. But let me just take a step back for one moment and talk about customers and employees. Customers' expectations continue to evolve. And they evolve at a rapid and increasing pace. And let me explain what I mean by that. If you're a customer of anything in an organization, of any service, what's excellent this year is next year's expected average. Does that make sense? So there's a constant escalation, if you like a treadmill, and it's going faster and faster around what customers expect from organizations. And in order to meet and exceed those expectations, you have to be really agile, really innovative, really quick, and so on as an organization. Well, let me tell you, employees are just the same. The expectations of employees are moving on the same treadmill. What is excellent this year is next year's expected, and the following year's average. So you have to be agile, you have to be innovative, you have to have a great HR function, you have to have great leadership in order to meet and need the expectation of employees. As a result of that treadmill, and against the backdrop of labor shortages around the world, we've seen some really fascinating trends. And I've got about 6 or so that I'm going to share with you today that I hope continue, because I think they're really good for organizations. The first is the notion of organization design, OD, as many organizations call it. And there's a very silly game that's played here that's propagated by many management consultancies. And that is that you bring in the consultancy, you look at your organization, you find that your design's all broken, you have a massive reorganization, you then leave it for 5 years until it's broken again, and then you disrupt the whole organization all over again. Let me tell you, we're moving from organization design into what I call organization dynamics. Let's change OD, org dynamics. Let's ensure that the support that you're getting from management consultancies, if you need them, is around helping you to continually evaluate your structures on an ongoing basis, so that we do not have these 5-year cycles of annual bang that disrupt organizations. So my hope now is that organizations can learn from the past and actually evolve their designs in a much more fluid, with much more fluidity. So that's one theme. The second theme is around workforce planning. Workforce planning for the good organization is about getting the right person in the right job at the right time. And that made sense. Good organizations were doing that, but it's old hat. Let me tell you why. It now needs to be work task planning. Where we need to be moving is to think about what are the tasks, what are the things that the business needs to solve for, and then what's the best way of solving that issue. Now, that might be through a supplier. It might be outsourced. It might be through Odgers. It might be it might be a robot, it might be technology, it might be offshore, or it might be somebody that you hire. So you need to think more broadly now about what needs to be done and how best to solve that in organizations. That's the planning of the future. The next one, the third one I would share with you, is around talent acquisition. You know, years ago, when you think about how films were made in Hollywood, they were made with huge staff. You know, think of The Wizard of Oz. They would have had every expert, every part of the production team employed by a huge studio. And if you think about one of the biggest franchises now in the world is the James Bond franchise. They have about 6 people that work for them. And the reason they have 6 people that work for them is they manage a talent ecosystem of, they bring in deep water experts or mountain climbers or whatever's needed for the production, and they manage an ecosystem of specialists. For me, talent now is moving from talent management to a talent ecosystem. And let me tell you one thing that I saw that I thought was really fascinating. What about having people who don't even work for you on your succession charts for your organization, for your CEO role or whatever else? Somebody else that you think's right, that's part of your talent ecosystem, that actually works for an entirely different organization. So for me, we've got to think differently. We've also got to think around this talent ecosystem around How open and transparent are the views, aspirations, interests, and mobility of your employees relative to the organization being familiar with what your employees actually want? We used to do a lot of talent planning where we used to guess people's mobility. We used to guess that this person had moved from Dubai to London, and then guess what? They said no on the 11th hour. So a more transparent and open talent ecosystem, and one that goes beyond the boundaries of your own organization, is what I would say is the third trend. Fourth trend is we still hear people talk about, is this person a culture fit? You know, when you've got candidates and you're recruiting, are they a good culture fit? And you know what? I think that's a great debate, and important that you get people who are aligned to the values of your organization, totally. But culture fit is dangerous. The reason it's dangerous is culture fit leads to recruitment that ends up with a homogenous group of people. You don't want culture fit, you want culture add. So you definitely want to assess people, but use methodologies that allow you to assess whether people in front of you are good alignment with your values, but will add to your culture. Otherwise, you're going to have a diversity issue.
Yep.
The fifth issue, and I'm nearly at the end, but I'm very excited about all these topics because there's a lot been going on for the last 5 years, right? It's something that I would call, and it's a rather grand title, but it's a simple thing, the democratization of leadership.
Right.
The democratization of leadership is simply this, that organizations have realized that for too long, they've trained people as managers from the junior all the way through in an organization way too high before inspirational leadership type training comes in. You have to be almost a senior manager before true leadership training comes in. No, that needs to start at a much lower level. So we need to push down in organizations, particularly in retail and customer serving organizations. We need to push down this managerial process type training, procedural compliance, still important, but it needs to be pushed down so that more inspirational leadership starts at a more junior level. And that's a factor that I think is really important. Fifth one is around diversity. Now, diversity for many years has been seen as CSR, which is corporate and social responsibility. Let me tell you, CSR should stand for core strategic response. Core strategic response. Why? Because of the workforce cliff that I talked about earlier, clearly diversity has and continue to be a core business matter. What I would also say is that the real dividends for organization is not focusing on diversity. That's not where the true business value comes. The value comes from focusing on inclusivity.
Mm-hmm.
You see many organizations that have gone for diversity and they've focused on the metrics of diversity. And then there's cynicism in the organization. People arguing, why haven't we just got a meritocracy? Why do we focus on this diversity? Diversity matters. A diverse meritocracy matters. But a real focus on inclusivity means that when you bring diverse people into the organization, it's somewhere that they thrive. So a real focus on inclusivity, not just diversity. And in fact, focusing on inclusivity actually gets you the diversity. It's a means to an end. And so that's a different attitude in terms of how we're thinking. Final one, and this is one that I have a huge passion about, and that is around one of the most important things in organizations that links to talent, that links to employee engagement, that links to the success of a business, is a simple process called performance management. You know, your annual appraisal, performance management, it massively, massively impacts your talent ecosystem. And let me tell you, the performance management in most businesses doesn't perform. There is simply no correlation between all of that process that you have of appraisals and annual appraisals and whatever, and actually driving the performance of an organization. The correlation is very poor. So businesses are broadly not very happy that performance, when they think about it, is being driven by that process. And what's even worse is that employees don't like it anyway. You find me a group of people who look forward to their annual appraisal. You find me a group of people who think that it adds value, that it's a motivating thing to do. It doesn't exist because the process is broken. In fact, in 2015, Deloitte added up all of their performance time that they were spending in their organization, their own organization, and it was 2 million hours. And the sad thing was that 2 million hours wasn't spent between the employee and the manager trying to be helpful. No, it was 2 million hours, majority of which was managers talking to managers about calibration, about the individual people issues, and so on and so forth. It was not driving value. So I want to move performance management to performance motivation. You cannot manage the performance of humans. We are not robots, but you can motivate the performance of humans. And in order to do that, we really need to focus on not just renaming the process, but focusing on the things that help you to recognize in the right way, see what's going on in the right way, and fuel growth. And in order to do that, the process needs to be as much about the learning of the manager and what they need to do differently, as well as the employee. We've got to get rid of this annual batching process where your entire work for a year is batched into this sort of half-an-hour horrible chat. And so the point that I've got here is one of the most fundamental processes around people and adding value needs to shift and is shifting from this horrible process of performance management. And I'll finish on this point. This is a great example of where you're strategizing for the majority and not the minority. And what you're finding a lot of people practices in organizations is that you design them for the one idiot in a million that does something wrong, as opposed to the 99.9% of people that you need to motivate and get driving the organization. This is a classic case of turning it on its head, removing some of those employment lawyers who get in the way of good people practice, and actually focusing on the things that drive performance and motivating people. And that for me is a key thing. If there's one thing that businesses could do for me is have a look at their performance management system and see whether the employer and the employee really gets value from it. And if not, change it.
And I think some of the key things that you've raised there, David, particularly around the titles of some of those trends and the titles of some of those processes and procedures, I think them in itself goes to show how disruptive the HR function and practices need to change to go forward. And I think I couldn't agree with you more regarding a group of people with their personal development plans or whatever it's called. That would be probably one of my toughest search to date, to find those people that see their current one as certainly the annual ones. David, I thank you very much. We are going to do a second series and interview with you if time permits, and we'll talk more about your new prediction or predictions and a few other questions that our audience might be interested to know from a HR practitioner with your experience. But for now, I just want to say thank you very much for your time, and I wish you a pleasant morning.
Thank you, David. Look forward to it.